guys, how's it going? Eli here, back with another video where today we're going to be having a conversation about investing in singles. Without further ado, let's just jump right into it. So as always, getting out of the way, if you want to enter into our weekly giveaways, all you have to do is be subscribed, leave a like, and comment down below on any of the pre-recorded videos we post each and every week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Of course, you can comment and like on each video, so that allows you for multiple entries. And then we've got 3 winners each and every week, so 3 opportunities to win. But now, jumping into today's topic, let's get things rolling. Now, we'll see, of course, how long this topic could be, because I don't want to dive too deep into it. I want to give you guys a general grasp in terms of learning to invest in singles. But, you know, I get this question asked a lot, and I want to give a shout out to some of our followers who come in on the live stream. They tend to ask me a lot of really good questions. I'm going to shout out John Doan specifically. He kept asking me a lot of questions in terms of just general investing. A couple other people asked me questions in terms of general investing for, alternate art designs and just certain specific single cards. Are they worth investing? Are they not worth investing? And so I thought it'd be worth a conversation in terms of, hey, is this something that I feel like is worth an investment? And if so, why? And so I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a breakdown, really having a conversation about what I look at when determining, is this a card that I think is worth the investment in the medium, short to long term? And there's a lot of factors, I would say, that are at play. But ultimately, at the end of the day, my entry points are always going to more or less stay the same. So here's a couple of bullet points that I want you guys to follow and kind of think of when you're generally considering these things. So the first thing I would say, and taking this, of course, into consideration, is it within the standard rotational format? Now, the reason why that's extremely important is because it's going to play 2 factors for this specific card, right? One, if it is a card that potentially has competitively viable value. For example, for those of you guys who have been following what's been going on in the current competitive scene, there's been a lot of Lost Zone decks that have been kind of taking over, and one of the cards in particular that has started to see rise in value has been the Empoleon V Card. This card, of course, has absolutely skyrocketed within the past month, and that is because it's a really good counter for some of the meta decks. Now, you can say to yourself, of course, you look at this card and you say, well, it's an alt art, and have the conversation about, well, okay, why wasn't this valued greater previous to the current value that it has, having doubled within the past month? And I think that really comes down to battle styles as a set overall. People are not the biggest fan of the overall set, but because certain cards now have competitive viability, aka one of those being the Empoleon card, it is going to increase itself in value. You've seen cards outside of the alt art, just other versions of the Empoleon, so like the full art version. It has also increased itself in value because it is competitively viable. That's why it's important to take a look at certain cards that are in the rotational format that can be used in competitive decks, because if you are someone that does pay attention to the competitive card game, you can find a real opportunity and value in terms of these things. Of course, with that, another thing that's even more important to also look into and consider is there are certain specific cards that you might, for example, think are worth a really good investment because, it's at the low in terms of its overall chart within the past, let's say, 6-month period, right? However, it's still about another 1.5 years before the set goes out of rotation, which means there's a high possibility that you could be seeing that set get a reprint, which in turn, sure, it's the all-time low as it is right now, but what if that all-time low drops another 25, 30, 40, 50% because of future reprints? Cards are going to get affected the most by that because, of course, they're just going to continue to increase. They're not deflationary like sealed product. And so that's why it's important to understand just general rotation, both from a collectability side of things and having a good entry point, but also for those people that want to learn to have a quick flip mentality of a lot of these competitively viable cards, because there is money that's to be made on both ends of the spectrum. Now, the next thing I also think is extremely important to consider, this can play into the short-term pickup game, this can play into the long-term pickup game, but I would more than likely say just taking into consideration what is the spread between the graded card and the ungraded card. And now this is something that I've really pointed to a lot I've had tons of questions in terms of alternate art card designs of, hey, Eli, do you think this card is, underappreciated, overappreciated? And we're going to point to one in specific that, of course, was pointed out not too long ago. So one of the cards in particular that we are going to take a look at is the Glacion Vmax. So if you look at just the general spread of the card itself, the PSA 9 compared to the the TCG player, it's about a $10 spread. So if you're saying to yourself that, hey, I can literally go right now and buy the 9 card for only $10 more, why would you want to go and get the raw version? Of course, some people are like, well, there's a chance of getting a 10 on it. Well, sure, if you want to spend the money and, the risk to reward ratio, in your opinion, is there for potentially getting a 10, then go for it. By all means, you can take that risk to reward. But obviously, if you don't hit that 10, you're just losing money. Same concept kind of applies here when you're literally able to get the PSA 9 for almost the exact same price. So unless you're hitting that 10 for this card, then it's one of those things where it could totally not be worth it to you to just go in and buy that raw card, because you're saying, I'd much rather just go buy the slab. You don't have a PSA membership. You're saying, hey, I don't have a PSA membership. I don't want to spend the money to go get it. And if you're going to send in bulk grading, you're going to have to spend or you're going to have to at least send in 20 plus cards. Sure, if you want to do that, then you can go do that. But at the end of the day, if you're saying to yourself, this card is pretty off-centered that I bought or that I pulled, why would I go get it graded if I can just at this point go sell it for the same value if I think it's going to get a 9? Same concept is going to apply for that when looking at investing. I think that there's a correlation at this point in time where once that spread starts to get too close, there's an overvaluing in terms of the overall just cards themselves. I think this is, of course, a perfect example with this, and either one of two things is going to have to happen. Either the TCG player is going to have to absolutely plummet to kind of give a spread with the PSA 9, or the PSA 9 is going to have to increase in value because there shouldn't be that disconnect between the two. Now, a perfect example, and this is where I'm going back to giving a shout out of one of the cards that was then shown of a good example, is actually a Noivern V. This is a good example of a spread. If you look at the most recent sale of the card compared to the current price, it's around $28 and then it's $60. That's TCG player. You can probably find it cheaper raw elsewhere. Of course, it's sold at a high of 80. It's sold at a low of 44. So you got to take this into consideration. But if you just look at the most recent sales, there's an opportunity where you're going and you're saying, hey, if I don't get that 10 and I get a 9, I'm either breaking even or I'm still making money off of it. That's a really good risk to reward ratio return. And that's one of the things I like to consider. I know everyone's going to say, Eli, well, you're only looking at the 9s. Look at the 10 values. Well, that's great and all. And you're saying to yourself that, okay, well, if you are one of those individuals that wants to go drop $1,000 and then just mass grade certain cards, then you can go ahead and do that. But if you're playing the risk of saying to yourself, I'm going to go on TCG player and I'm going to expend a ton of capital trying to, pick out which ones I potentially think could be, the best, I like to go in with the mentality or the mindset that, hey, these guys are putting it on TCG player, especially these bigger stores, because why would they end up grading it if they think there's a shot of it potentially getting a 9? And at their point, they're like, well, rather than wait for the time and the fees because there's an inherent risk to going and sending it in, if you could potentially see that value drop, if, let's say, a reprint happens, prices absolutely crash. So there's a ton of risk involved with that. Why not just cash out at that point right now? So the inherent risk is there because you can sit and look at the 10 value now, but if there's a reprint that happens for the set and the 10 plummets and your 9 value just all of a sudden goes down, you want at least to have a little bit of wiggle room so that you can make that adjustment in case it's price correct, against you. And I think that's just being really conservative with your risk at that point. So that's a really important thing I think that you guys should consider. Of course, now a lot of these things I'm looking at, like I had said before, this is a strategy that you can look at and saying, hey, is this card undervalued? Hey, is this card overvalued? Of course, Evolving Skies, it's in rotation still. So if we're going through our factors on things, Umbreon Vmax, it's in rotation. It's got a really thin spread. I think the value's not there to where it'd be a card that I pick up for those reasons. Obviously, if we're looking at the chart, of course, with the Noivern is in rotation. However, you haven't seen a real growth and the spread there is really good. I would say it's still worth a pickup because you haven't really seen that same pop, and it's one of the top performing full arts, or I should say one of the top most valuable full arts within Evolving Skies. And so the fact that it hasn't had its time to shine, and it's a pretty cool alt art design, I think that there's definitely some opportunity. Now, of course, is it one of my favorite pickups? No, not at all, but that's just because for me personally and how I tend to look at my general strategy is I like to go through and look at certain sets, for example, let's say Shining Fates, or, Chilling Rain or Battle Styles that have some cards that if you'd gone through and picked up some of their best cards after they've been printed in the ground and got a really good opportunity, then your risk to reward would be great. However, this is an example of a set that has been underprinted and you can still find value within it, within certain specific cards that could see value in the future. We don't know, of course, if an Evolving Skies reprint's going to happen, so that's the risk you're playing by buying it now. But once again, it depends on the time frame you're looking at from this perspective, because if it's a short-term versus a long-term perspective, you look at things in a whole different kind of limelight in that regard, which of course plays into the next conversation, which is your time frame. What is your general time frame that you're trying to go in and you're trying to buy or flip or have this card kind of returned on? And this is the question that I think people really need to take into consideration when deciding whether or not to buy or not, and if it's worth the risk to reward ratio. Reason why I say that is because, once again, going back to the consideration of rotation and cards being in print, we can take a look at Vivid Voltage as a perfect example and say to ourselves, hey, if you had first bought the Chonkachu, whether it be raw, whether it be graded, when the card itself first came out, and you had not waited, you had not been patient, then obviously it's something to consider when you've lost over 50% in value. It would have definitely been one to wait on because the value has absolutely tanked. There's been a ton of there's been a ton of reprints for this card, and so the value's not there. This is a set that relatively soon is going to more than likely go to rotation within the next 3 to 6 months. With that, there's a potential opportunity that's going to be there in terms of investing in this card that I think you're more than likely going to be getting in the overall bottom at this point. And for that reason, that's why I'm a fan of investing in Vivid Voltage as a set, or specifically a fan of investing in the Vivid Voltage VMAX Pikachu. Because sure, you can say, obviously, this is a card that has a much greater supply and population. And this is a card that obviously, when it first came out, it had its opportunities to go be submitted for the lower positional grade prices. But as far as it goes, this is the only main chase card we've ever had in an era of Sword and Shield, let alone just history in terms of having a main set built around Pikachu. Obviously, we've had certain Pikachu cards that have been of value, Gold Star Pikachu and others. But this is the first time we've really had a main center set around this card, and so sure, I'm going to discredit its value a little bit and give it a ding based off the overall population for the PSA 10, but that doesn't determine the fact of the matter, or that doesn't deter me from the fact of the matter that I still think this is a card that if you want to invest in it, I think there's still opportunity to be made, because as we've been very aware, even if certain, booster box sets, even if certain cards obviously have a high supply, as long as the demand's there to counterbalance it, then that's something you have to take into consideration. Now, this is for a specific set, of course, that was during the time of when PSA was closed down. Let's go take a look at a set where PSA was not closed down, or let's go take a look at a set that more or less has some of the alternate art designs, and you've seen the prices start to make their adjustments where they're coming back up again after they had been kind of on a downturn for a while, and when would have been the best time to pick up this specific card or some of the other counterpart cards. So first question you ask yourself, right, is what is the spread on this card, right? Spread is 152 versus 103. Not a bad spread by any means. You're saying to yourself, you're sending this in, let's say you're sending it in with the bulk entry, you're going to more than likely at least make your monies back on it. And as well, in terms of the overall PSA population report on this card, this was a set that came out right after PSA closed. And so as it stands right now, there's still a ton of, opportunity in terms of population. But here's where the risk to reward comes into perspective. And this goes back to the fact of the matter of reprints and submissions. With the Pikachu, we know right now that it was mass submitted during the time of when PSA's prices were a lot cheaper. It's seen that adjustment. This card has not seen that adjustment since prices have started to, of course, come down again for PSA. They've started to open back up again. We don't know what the overall population of this card could increase to, so you're playing that risk to reward. However, that's where you have to determine for yourself, hey, there's a spread, $100 for raw, $152 for the 9. If I send it in now, knowing that prices are cheaper, am I taking that risk that that spread's going to be enough and I could potentially, you know, make out with PSA 10 value, which is almost going to triple the value of the card? I mean, that's something you could totally look into consideration. And obviously, if we're just looking at the overall value of the 9 itself, or sorry, of the raw card itself, you're saying, all right, well, where's the value standing right now? Let's see, 135 was the high. You know, it's sitting at around $100. So yeah, it had a low at around 94 at one point, but it's still pretty similarly close to its low. So, you know, Chilling Reigns, a set that has only had 2 prints. It wasn't a set that was highly printed. It had its wave 1, wave 2. And so for that reason, it's still relatively scarce when you talk about the actual card value, and it's just an underrated set, I would say, as to why the booster boxes are a lot cheaper. It was a victim of its time when Wave 2 came out. And so, you know, you've got that opportunity with a lot more scarcity in terms of the overall supply of the cards. The supply of the PSA is low. The value of the card is pretty much at its point right now where it's at a near low. And on top of that, it's got a pretty nice spread. So there's a lot of things to consider with this card that you can make an argument that, hey, it's worth a pickup, whether it be something that you say, it's not overvalued from a raw perspective. It's not overvalued from if I were to grade it, send it in for a 9 or 10 perspective. And so that's, of course, very important to consider. Which then leads into my next point, and we've got one more point after this for wrapping it up, which is taking into consideration overall print of a set. Going back to the Vivid Voltage, Vivid Voltage was a set that obviously was printed very heavily. Battlestar is a set that's been printed very heavily. And so taking that into consideration is extremely important, because as we've, you know, played the game of adjusting to the overall prints in which the Pokemon Company has done recently compared to during COVID, right? They did it in waves, they spread it out, and they tended to basically print as much as they could. Well, recently they've dialed it back. They started to do only one full wave. They dropped at the beginning. And so now you have to take into consideration these factors, because certain cards before, we would say, hey, let's wait. There's going to be a second wave. There's going to be a third wave confirmed. There's no point of course, jumping the gun on this, because there's going to be opportunities later down the road. But now that we only have one print for certain sets, you know, Lost Origins, Astral Radiance, we have to take these things into consideration when saying, hey, is it one of those things where it's worth picking up the card now? Is it worth one of those things where, you know, we should realistically wait on it because there could potentially be reprints for the set, but we realistically don't know? And that's why we're kind of in this weird time frame or this weird area of, we're going into a recessionary period. There's a lot of economic factors that are going to play root with that. And the Pokemon Company has had no mention so far of any sort of booster box reprints for any of these newer sets. Astral Radiance, Lost Origin, Brilliant Star, and some other things as well. So that's one thing that you are going to have to take into consideration. Now, I've, of course, under the impression, if we look at history, there's a big opportunity or big potential for reprints to happen for the booster boxes within the next month or two. But of course, that is still speculative, that we're just basing off of history and what the Pokemon has done historically for reprints. So you have to once again take that into consideration when saying to yourself, hey, is this a good time to pick up now? Because I don't think there's going to be a reprint in the future. And if I'm trying to make a quick flip, I'm going to buy now, expect the value to go up because the item's going to be scarce, and then sell before a reprint. Or if there's no reprint, great, I'm going to just keep holding. Or is there a reprint opportunity that's going to come soon, and I think the price is going to drop relatively soon, so I might as well wait? Those are things you really have to take into consideration, especially when you look at the most recent set. And so the last one or two things I want to actually take into consideration. I lied. I said I had one more thing. But the next most important thing, and this really just goes back and ties down to the scarcity of the print of the card, is now pull rates. Pull rates have something that, you know, we've seen a huge factoring in terms of value with the most recent alternate art cards. Don't get me wrong, the designs on the cards are very pretty, but in terms of the overall pull rates for any of the alternate arts in the Lost Origin set, obviously you've seen that the scarcity of these cards is extremely low. It's a low printed set in the grand scheme of things, of course. It's a set that has extremely low pull rates, and so that's something that you're going to have to once again take into consideration. And then lastly, just kind of driving it home on some things to kind of consider and some things to kind of look at is what is the art or the character value of that specific card when you're investing. That's something I think that's extremely important to take into consideration, because as we've seen most recently, but of course we've seen historically with characters doing well, alternate art designs that have gorgeous artwork is going to increase its value. Of course, we do love character rares. Like, let's not that, we do love alternate arts with really nice characters, and we do love cards with characters. But, and historically, they've always done extremely well. If you see Lugia cards, if you see Rayquaza cards, etc., etc. However, we've seen with the introduction of alternate art cards, in the Sun and Moon era, now getting enhanced in the Sword and Shield era, a real appreciation for artworks. And that was one of the things where, I had that conversation with another fellow YouTuber, Nostalgianomics, in terms of, hey, do we think that the card value is there for the Machamp because of art designs, or are we having value because this is market manipulation? I said if Aerodactyl had its value increased, because this is one of my favorite art designs of all time for a Pokemon card, then I would full on believe it. Well, what do you know? Pre-release for the card, $91. Release of the card, doubled in price. So the value was 100% there in terms of the card's appreciation for the artwork. So we've seen recently that artwork has really been something that is to be appreciated, and now that's a factor we're really going to have to take into consideration for future sets to come. So when we do have that Silver Tempest set, obviously everyone's going to be a big fan of the Lugia. Let's say there's another card that's going to be pushed in that set. Let's say, for example, an Unknown V-Star, and they make an Unknown V card that puts you in the Sinnoh Caves, and it has an absolutely amazing design. You could potentially see a card like that absolutely jump in value. You might say, Unknown, no one gives a crap about Unknowns. Neither do I, but the nostalgic value that you can really bring to that because of the background designs like the Aerodactyl, which has all the fossil Pokemon and it really has a theme that it plays to it. I think you can really touch on that with art designs, and there's going to be a ton of opportunity for that in the future. But as far as it goes, looks like wasn't too long, too short, but I had a lot of things, of course, to go over in consideration when it comes to deciding what to invest in and why. Of course, some of the things, as mentioned before, taking a look at general scarcity in terms of overall just booster box print, general scarcity in terms of pull rate, general scarcity in terms of population. So scarcity playing a huge factor in these three aspects. Once again, playing on art design, playing on character value. Those are things that are going to play a huge factor as well. And then, of course, having a conversation about the overall PSA spread. If you're saying that the TCG card value is greater than the 9, there's an overvaluing of the raw card, or there's an undervaluing of the PSA card. You can, of course, take everything into consideration with that. But at the end of the day, these are kind of the main factors to consider when investing in Pokemon single cards and Pokemon graded cards. But as far as it goes, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to enter into our weekly giveaways, make sure you leave a like, comment down below, and subscribe to the YouTube channel. We post pre-recorded content for you to like and comment on each and every week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Of course, since you can comment and like on each video, that allows you for multiple entries. And then we have 3 winners each and every week, which means multiple opportunities to win. But that is all I have for today's video. Thank you guys all so much for watching. Until then, I will see you all on Friday. Peace.